What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we'll be diving into 5 more budget decks here for MTG Arena Standard. Each of these budget decks are focused on being budget, as well as looking ahead into the future by trying to focus on playing only cards that are from the past year of sets, so they are rotation proof and you won't have to worry about replacing cards come that time frame. These cards are also pretty decent as they play around some of the tribes that exist currently in MTG Arena with the sets. With that being said, let's just dive into the decks and let's just start talking about them. So the first deck up on the list is going to be a Rakdos Vampires deck. Vampires is actually one of those interesting kind of deck types or tribal types that I feel like, you feel like they were definitely in a good position because they have all the vampires from Innistrad and also Crimson Vow. But it's kind of one of those archetypes that really never really panned out. But with rotation happening and things like that, Vampires could be in line to possibly be another decent deck to be like that mid-rangey / aggro deck of the format. And also with the addition of Evelyn from Streets of New Capenna, it could be one of those decks that also forces your opponent's cards on your opponent. But overall, what we're trying to do with the deck is kind of play that early game, trying to be that aggressive deck in that regard, and kind of clear things up after the battlefield and kind of take over and be aggressive in that manner. We do that by playing, 1 mana Blood Fountain. It creates a blood token, comes on the battlefield. In the later game, we can tap 4 mana, sacrifice it, return 2 target creature cards from a graveyard to our hand, so it gets creatures back that may have been already killed or sacrificed due to particular abilities. And the benefit, like I said, is get blood tokens. After that, we have Voldaren Epicure, a 1 mana 1/1, enters the battlefield. It deals 1 damage to each opponent, which could be definitely beneficial for some of the cards we play in the deck, as well as it creates a blood token, just piling on those blood tokens as much as we can. We have Infernal Grasp here as a spot removal spell, 2 mana, or destroy target creature for 2 mana, and you lose 2 life in the process. Infernal Grasp is shaping up to be probably the best 2 mana removal currently in the format come rotation, so it's definitely good to probably play a few copies of that. We have Vampire Interloper, 2 mana, 2/1, no flying, can't block. But yet again, if the ground game gets a little clogged up, it can possibly fly over for those points of damage, which is definitely very good, especially in an aggro deck. We've got Sanguine Statuette, a 2 mana artifact that enters the battlefield, creates a blood token, and then whenever we sacrifice a blood token, we may have it become a 3/3 vampire artifact creature with haste until end of turn, which is definitely pretty awesome. So if we play it on like a turn 3 where we play it for 2, sacrifice a blood token, discard, and draw a card, it becomes a creature, or we can catch our opponent off guard by sacrificing a blood token on their turn and maybe use it as a blocker if we need to. Then we have Blood Tithe Harvester, definitely a card that you've seen a lot of, especially in the Rakdos sacrifice decks, but it definitely fits very well in a natural vampire deck, being a 2 mana 3/2 vampire that enters the battlefield that creates a blood token. And then we can also sacrifice it and give target creature -X/-X, which gets around indestructibility, where X is twice the number of blood tokens that we control. And with the amount of blood tokens that we can create with this deck, we can definitely kill some pretty decently sized creatures. After that, we have Hungry for More. It's a 2 mana sorcery that creates a 3/1 black-red vampire creature token with trample, lifelink, and haste. And then we get to sacrifice at the beginning of the next end step. So a little bit of an aggressive play. You can create a blood vampire, swing in, deal some damage, and then recast it maybe again on the following turn for 3 mana. So it's a spell that we can cast multiple times. We got Vampire Socialite, 2 mana 2/2 with Menace, which is definitely very good for even a 2 mana. When it enters the battlefield, if an opponent lost life this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on each other vampire you control. So depending on when she enters the battlefield, if it's on turn 2 and you have a Voldaren Epicure, maybe you've dealt 1 point of damage, the Voldaren Epicure now goes up to a 2/2, which is okay, but if you play in the later game after dealing some damage to an opponent, you can buff the whole team. And then as long as an opponent has lost life this turn, each other vampire we control enters the battlefield with additional +1/+1 counter, so she also helps buff other creatures that we may play after her on the battlefield. We got Hero's Downfall here. Come rotation, we don't really have too many, I guess, cheap ways to really remove planeswalkers, and depending on how many planeswalkers are being played, I'm sure Ob Nixilis will probably be still around, and then probably like Elspeth, and then you'll probably see Kaido, to name a few. But yet again, just having a 3 mana destroy target planeswalker card is definitely very good, as well as creature, so it's definitely flexible in that regard. We got Florian, Voldaren Scion, a 3 mana 3/3. One of the key cards to help us kind of stay aggressive and look for answers depending on what the game state is. It's a 3 mana 3/3 with first strike. At the beginning of our post-combat main phase, which is initially right after the combat damage is assessed and the opponent takes it, we get to look at the top X cards of our library. X is the number of life lost that our opponent has lost this turn. So even if we don't attack, but we play like in a Voldaren Epicure, we'll still be able to look at 1 card. And then we get to exile one of those cards and put the rest on the bottom of our library in any random order. And then we can play that exile card until end of turn. So either possibly get another creature, possibly spot removal. Depending on what the game state is, we can definitely get a card that we could use. And then after that, we have Evelyn in the 5-mana drop slot. Kind of one of those cards that kind of help us maybe, annoy the opponent by being a 5-mana 2/5. We can cast it on our turn. We can also flash it in at the end of our opponent's turn or in response to an attack if we don't think they have like a pump spell or some sort of response. But when she enters the battlefield or whenever another vampire enters the battlefield under our control, we get to exile the top card of each player's library, put a collection counter on them, and then once per turn we may play a card from exile with a collection counter on them and spend mana as if it was any color to cast that spell, which is definitely pretty effective, especially using your opponent's spells against them is definitely always frustrating, especially if you're the opponent. And she'll probably be one of those vampires you'll see around, not just in a vampire list, but probably in some or other Grixis and or Rakdos lists. But she's definitely a pretty good vampire to round out the deck. Mana base is pretty straightforward. I know because we are playing a little bit of a lower curve, you probably could get away with playing like 22 to 23 lands, but I like to kind of like depend on the deck because we do have the 5-drop. I want to make sure we hit our land drop, so I do have 24, 10 and 10 of mountains and swamps, and then we have 4 of the tap dual land that comes in the battlefield tapped, and we gain 1 life. And then in the sideboard, I just have some other cards that you can look out for if you already have them in your collection that could be useful to add into the deck if you have them and want to use them. You have things like Slaughter Specialist, which is a ground creature, vampire, warrior that's for 2 mana, it's a 3/3. Though you do give your opponent a 1/1 human creature token, but when her secondary ability is whenever a creature an opponent would control die, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on Slaughter Specialist, so you can attack him pretty aggressively. If they throw the 1/1 token in front of her to block, she'll get bigger. If you use spot removal spells on any of their creatures, she'll get bigger. So she's kind of one of those things that your opponent has to deal with early, and with the lack of direct, we lose like monocolor exile effects, she's definitely a pretty decent card to have in the 2-drop slot. You got Voldaren Bloodcaster, another vampire flyer that whenever a non-token or her die, we create a blood token, so pumping up blood tokens onto the battlefield. And if we have 5 or more blood tokens, we transform her into her 3/3 form. And at the beginning of our combat, we get to turn one of our blood tokens now into a 2/2 back creature token with flying and haste, which makes it definitely very good. And it's still technically a blood token, so we can always sacrifice it as well, which is definitely pretty awesome. Got Cemetery Gatekeeper, a pretty interesting card. It's a 2-mana 2/1 first striker. Enters the battlefield, exile a card from a graveyard. Whenever a player plays a land or casts a spell, if it shares a type with the exile card, it deals 2 damage to that player. So it kind of like penalizes your opponent and also penalizes us. But depending on how aggressive you are and how aggressive of a start you get, you may actually be able to put a lot of pressure on your opponent, and it may make them reconsider how they want to play cards from their hand if their life total starts getting low. You have Falconwrath Forebearer, 3-mana 3/1. It can't block, but it has flying, and then whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we could have blood token, and for the cost of 1 mana, sacrifice 2 blood tokens. We could turn it from the graveyard to the battlefield, which is definitely pretty awesome. The one thing that is kind of cool that you can kind of do is you can always use discard to a blood token and then cheat it back out later in the game when you collect 2 blood tokens and then pay it for only 1 mana and do it at instant speed, which is definitely pretty good. Then we have Blood Vial Purveyor, an interesting card here. It's a 5/6 for 4 mana, which is definitely very good. Has flying and trample as well. But whenever opponent casts a spell, that player creates a blood token, so that gives your opponent a possibility of using a blood token to draw a card by discarding a card. But whenever it self-attacks, it gets +1/+0 to end a turn for each blood token the defended player controls. So it's one of those things that's at least going to attack for 5, if not more, depending on if your opponent's using their blood tokens that they're creating. But definitely an interesting card to kind of look out for. A pretty decent aggressive 4-drop in the deck. Got Henrika here in the deck, another great 4-drop that could be pretty good in the deck, in the fact that she has 3 abilities on her main side, and she's a 1/3 flyer. At the end of her upkeep, we can choose one that hasn't been chosen. We can make each player sacrifice a creature, so we get rid of one of our weaker creatures. Also make our opponent have to sacrifice and make the choice of what to sacrifice to that ability. We can draw a card at the cost of 1 life. Or we can just transform her to her 3/4 side, and she gains the ability of flying, death touch, and lifelink, and she grows in power, and she's a 3/4. And then for 3 mana, each creature we control flying, death touch, and or lifelink. Then we'll also get additional +1/+0, so it has a little bit of a mana sink in the later game if we really don't have any other plays. Sorin's another interesting card to add to the deck. It is another 4-drop. It is a Planeswalker that has the ability of a +1/1 to look at the top card of our library, and we can reveal that card, put it into our hand, and if we do, we lose life equal to its mana value, so a little bit of an aggressive card draw effect in Sorin. For -2, we can create a 2/3 vampire creature token with flying and lifelink, so gaining life is always very good, especially if we're losing life due to the +1 effect. And then if we get it ever to the -7, you can deal 13 damage to a target, then also gain 13 life, so kind of a good way to finish off your opponent depending on where you are in the game. Bloodthirsty Adversary is another interesting card here in the deck. We don't play a lot of spells or in this deck outside of a couple of spot removal spells, but definitely an interesting card. You know, for 2 mana, you can tap an additional 3. She'll come into the battlefield with additional +1/+1 counter for each time you paid that 3, and then every time you pay that 3, you get to exile a spell from the graveyard with a mana value 3 or less, and then essentially cast it for free. So you know, recast a spot removal spell, you can recast, you know, maybe a Hungry for More, and then she'll grow in power as well, and she also has haste, so she can kind of be an aggressive, you know, vampire in the deck. Got Dominating Vampire, another interesting card that I feel like is kind of, you know, a cool kind of take control of target creature opponent controls. It's one of those things that it depends on how many vampires you have out. And, you know, in the early game, you only have 1, 2, or 3 vampires at most. So you can take control of a creature based on the amount of vampires you control, with mana value based on how many vampires you control, I should say. And that creature then gets haste, and you get to attack in with it, and itself is a 3/3, so not too bad. Got Angie, Maid of Dishonor. Yet again, another 4-drop. I would say the one problem with vampires, it seems like a lot of the vampires that exist are in the 4-drop slot, so you have to kind of make your choices. But she's definitely not a bad one in the fact that she is a 4-mana 4/5, which is definitely pretty good. So, you know, she has a little bit more toughness than her mana cost. And then whenever her or another vampire enters the battlefield under our control, we create a blood token. It only triggers once, but creating blood tokens is always beneficial. And then for 2 mana, we can sacrifice another creature and or a blood token and drain our opponent for 2 life, and we gain 2 life in the process. And I also have Olivia here. She's another interesting kind of card that she is only a 3/4 for 6 mana, but whenever she attacks, she has flying and haste. We get to return target creature card from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped and attack, and it gains when you don't control a legendary vampire, exile this creature. When you start adding in more and more legendary vampires that we have in the sideboard, you'll hopefully have a bunch of legendary vampires in general out on the battlefield, and she's kind of like a good card to help finish off your opponent. And then as well in the sideboard, we have, you know, 4 copies of Haunted Bridge. It's a good land that, you know, can replace the tap land, as this is in the late game a land that comes in the battlefield untap. And then we also have the Castle Dracula of Voldaren Estate, depending on if you have the cosmetic or not, like I do. But it's a land that comes into the battlefield. It can tap for colorless, or you can tap it, pay 1 life, and add 1 mana of any color. And then you can only spend this mana to cast a vampire spell for playing vampires. So we have a lot of, you know, vampire spells we can cast. And then we can also tap 5 and tap it and create a blood token. And that ability costs 1 less for each to activate for each other vampire control. So it's in the late game, depending on how many vampires we have out, we can definitely, you know, tap it for, you know, 1 mana, 2 mana, maybe even just tap it without paying any mana. So definitely a pretty interesting land to kind of add to the deck. But overall, this is kind of a decent Rakdos Vampire deck if you're looking to maybe, you know, dive into vampires a little bit. I figure it's a good place to start. You can also make your own tweaks, and maybe, like I said, in the near future, when we get a little bit more clear picture on when we do like the 2023 queue, or we get closer to rotation, I'll probably look at possibly making an upgraded version of the deck that, you know, fully fledges it out in some form or manner. But with that being said, let's move on to the next deck. Now, the next deck up on the list is a mono red burn deck. It's kind of an interesting deck, as when rotation happens, we lose a lot out on a lot of our direct damage to our opponent's face, at least in the common and uncommon slot. So we do, in this version, have a balance of spells that do damage to our opponent to any target, as well as spells that kind of just get rid of creatures on the battlefield and or planeswalkers. So that is kind of like the weird balance we do play in here. The one card that kind of helps this deck work out is the Thermal Alchemist, being a 2 mana 0/3 defender, and it can tap and deal 1 damage to each opponent. But whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, we get to untap it and then essentially do it again if we want to. So it kind of works well with our instants and sorceries in the deck. But yet again, it's kind of trying to focus on burn, as well as being a little bit aggressive to at least get enough points of damage that maybe our burn can finish off our opponent. So in the 1-drop slot, we have Kamano, Faces of Kakazan. It's a 1 mana enchantment saga. On chapter 1, it deals 1 damage to each opponent and each planeswalker they control, which is definitely very good. You know, you kind of get this starting to ramp out, which is definitely pretty decent. Chapter 2 is whenever we cast our next creature spell this turn, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. And then chapter 3 is we exile, return it transformed on to the battlefield under our control, which then we get a 2/2 haster that if a creature would be dealt damage this turn by a sorcerer control would die, we get to exile instead, so allowing us to kind of remove things from the battlefield in general. Play with Fire, a 1 mana shock, essentially 2 damage to any target, but we do get the added benefit of whenever we deal damage to an opponent, we get to scry 1, so we can kind of look for answers off the top of our library and get rid of things that we don't need, like especially in the later game, we probably don't need a bunch of lands, so this is definitely a card that can help us filter those cards off. Got Rabbit Battery as another 1 mana 1/1 haster. That also has the ability of, for 1 mana, we can reconfigure a creature and equip this creature to another creature and give it +1/+1 and haste as well. So definitely a pretty decent aggressive 1 mana card. Got Strangle here for a solid 1 mana 3 damage to any target creature or planeswalker. So definitely good in that sense. It also has a spot removal spell for 1 mana. Got Thermal Alchemist, like I said, a good way to kind of just start draining our opponent for 1 point of damage, and that eventually adds up to the point that they're getting low on health. And depending on how many spells we can cast, we can ping our opponent multiple times in a single turn. Got Flame Channeler here as a 2 mana 2/2 that whenever a spell we control deals damage, we get to transform it. So if we play this on turn 3, we have, we play this and then we play like a Play with Fire, it'll transform into its 3/3 form, and then the 3/3 form has the ability of whenever a spell we control will deal damage, we get to put a flame counter on Embodiment of Flame, and then for 1 mana we can remove a flame counter from Embodiment of Flame, and we exile top card of our library and we can play that card. So it kind of has a built-in dig a little bit deeper into your deck to maybe find an answer effect, so the card is exiled at the end of the turn. We got Light 'em Up in here, so it's a 2 mana, 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker. And then for the cost of 2 power or greater creature, we can sacrifice it and copy the spell and do the spell to another target or to the same creature. So we can deal possibility of 4 damage for the cost of 2 mana, which is not that bad, and a creature. Got Reckless Impulse as a 2 mana, exile top 2 cards of our library until the end of next turn. You may play those cards, so kind of like some of the other effects in the deck, allows us to dig a little bit deeper, find some answers, possibly get a land if we need one. Definitely a decent card for 2. Then we also have the Voltic Visionary, 2 mana 3/1 that has an ability of tap it. Deals 2 damage to ourselves. We exile top card of our library, and then we can play that card this turn, activate it only as a sorcery. So yet again, our deck is not super expensive, so the worst thing we're going to do is find a 3 mana card. But by the time this can actually tap to do that ability, we'll probably have 3 mana out, as it is only a 2 mana drop. And then once it transforms, it becomes a 4/3, can't block, but decent aggressive creature nonetheless. And then in the 3-drop slot, we have 4 copies of Call in a Professional. A great mono red burn spell is going to be in standard, as it allows, it makes players not be able to gain life this turn. Damage can't be prevented, and Call in a Professional deals 3 damage to any target, so target creature or player. And then if we deal damage to a creature, if that creature has a shield counter, shield counters don't prevent damage as they're removed. So it removes the shield counter, but that damage also isn't prevented. So if the creature would die in the process, it would die, and the shield counter is not effective. So definitely a good spot removal spell there. And then we also have Chandra just to kill it, 2 copies. Just because it's a mythic, I didn't want to add too many rares / mythics in the deck, so I just figured I cut this in half and have it 2 additional copies. But she's a great planeswalker for being 3 mana with 3 loyalty. Her +1 allows us to add 1 mana to our mana pool. It deals 1 damage up to 1 target player or planeswalker, so we can kind of ping something for 1 point of damage, which definitely adds up over time. For other +1 ability, allows us to exile top card of our library. If it's red, we can cast it. Majority of our deck outside of lands, I guess, are considered red, so we can cast most of the spells in our deck if we get the mana available. And then if we ever get to the -7, we can exile top 5 cards of our library, and then you may cast those spells among them this turn, and then you get an emblem of whenever we cast a red spell. With this emblem, it deals X damage to any target, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast that spell. So definitely a card that is more effective and kind of turns a lot of our spells into other burn spells in general. And then because we are low curve to the ground, I went with 21 mountains in the deck. It's definitely a deck that you probably can get like 3-4 lands. It would be probably pretty decent. You can cast most things in the deck and cast multiple things at the same time. And then in the sideboard, I kind of went a little bit on if you want to shift it a little bit more aggro, or if you want to shift it a little bit more into casting spells. There's some cards that kind of do a little bit of both. So the first card up is Bloodthirsty Adversary. Yet again, a great card that if we can pay that additional 3, allows us to recast things from our graveyard again without actually having to pay their mana cost. And then this itself also comes to the battlefield with additional +1/+1 counters. And then even still, it's a 2 mana 2/2 haster, which is definitely very good. Got Cemetery Gatekeeper. Yet again, if you're on the aggro plan, giving your opponent damage every time they cast a spell that you were exiled with it, is definitely pretty good, even though it does also drain us for 2 points of damage, but definitely a good 2/1 for a striker. Got Reckless Stormseeker that turns any of our creatures into +1/+0s and also gives them haste, including itself for 3 mana. And then if it does trigger to a nighttime cycle, it becomes a 3/4 and gives target creature that we target with the ability +2/+0, trample, haste until end of turn. We got Thunder and Raiju as another possibility to add in the deck. A 4 mana 3/3 haster that whenever it attacks, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control. And then it deals, and then Thunder and Raiju will deal X damage to each opponent, where X is the number of modified creatures we control other than itself. So we could give the +1/+1 counter to one of our other creatures, and we'll at least do 1 point of damage. We also have one other way to kind of add that additional +1/+1 counter, so definitely not a bad card there. And then kind of get into some other cards if we want to kind of shift a little bit more into that mono red burn kind of style. Invoke Calamity is kind of an interesting card to add. I don't know if you want to add too many copies. Probably one of those things you want one or two of in the deck. But it allows us to cast 2 instances or sorcery spells with converted mana cost 6 or less from our graveyard and our hand without paying their mana cost. If the spells we put into the graveyard, exile them instead, and exile also Invoke Calamity. So if we used our burn spells, we tap for 5 mana and recast those burn spells, or cast 1 from our hand and 1 from the graveyard that we already played. So definitely interested there. Arcane Bombardment turns all our spells that we would cast, at least the first spell we cast during our turn, instant or sorcery. We have to exile a card at random from our graveyard, our spell from our graveyard, then copy that card, exile with Arcane Bombardment, and we can cast that any number of copies without paying their mana cost. So essentially allows us to replay some of our burn spells from the graveyard, allowing us to remove things from the battlefield, deal damage to our opponent's face, and not have to pay the additional mana to do so. Got Light Up the Night as an interesting kind of like finish them kind of card. It's an X red card. It deals X damage to any target. It deals X +1 damage instead if it targets a creature and or planeswalker. And then for 4 mana, you can remove X loyalty counters from among planeswalkers we control. If we do cast a spell this way, we deal X damage kind of instead. We don't tap mana for it, but for 4 mana, we can remove loyalty and deal damage based on how many loyalty counters we remove. So definitely not a bad card to double cast in a sense. Then we got Smolder and Egg here, another great card in the idea of if you want to go a little bit more on the spell side. It's a 2 mana 0/4 egg, which makes a great blocker. But whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, we have to put a number of ember counters on Smolder and Egg based on the mana spent to cast that spell. And then if it has 7 more ember counters on it, we remove them and transform it to its 4/4 side. And then the 4/4 side is a 4/4 flyer that whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, it deals 2 damage to any target. So it allows us to kind of deal damage to our opponent's face or deal damage to the creatures. And then if you want to add, you can add in some Sokuzen, Crucible of Defiance, probably like 1 or 2 at most. But the benefit of this is that we can also channel it for its 4 mana side, and it creates 2 1/1 colorless spirit token creatures that they gain haste to end a turn. Which is definitely pretty good, and it costs 1 less for each legendary creature we control. But overall, pretty interesting deck list. I feel like mono red is in an interesting place. I don't know if it's going to be burn or if it's going to be more aggro, but it's definitely a decent deck to check out, and it's pretty cheap to put together. Next deck up on the list is a Dimir Zombies deck. This is kind of one of those, just like Vampires, another archetype that I feel like has a lot of support because it does have about 2 sets to kind of help improve the set nonetheless. We do lose a little bit with Kaldheim shifting out, as we do lose like 2 cards that would be pretty decent in this deck. But I decided to kind of put together another Dimir Zombie deck, and it's definitely a deck that feels like it will be pretty decent, aggressive deck nonetheless. In the 1-drop slot, we just have a Champion of the Perished. It's a 1 mana 1/1 zombie that enters battlefield under control. Whenever a zombie enters battlefield under control, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Champion of the Parish, so that's definitely very good. Play this on turn 1, and then every zombie we play afterwards will just make it bigger. On turn 2, we can also cast Ghoulish Procession. It's a 2 mana enchantment that whenever 1 or more non-token creatures die, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed, and this ability only triggers once each turn. And that also includes our opponent's creatures, so if we remove their creatures, we also get zombie tokens out of it. Infernal Grasp here, a little bit of spot removal for 2 mana, destroy target creature, lose 2 life. Got Undead Butler, 2 mana 1/2. When it enters the battlefield, we build 3 cards. And then when it dies, we may exile it. If we do, we can return a creature card from the graveyard to our hand, so it allows us to kind of reoccur maybe a creature that may have died or got milled into our graveyard back to our hand to then play. Yeah, Blade Stick Scab, a 2 mana 2/3 that gives other zombies we control +1/+0, so just buffing the team, making them stronger. Got Skull Scab, a 2 mana 2/2 with Exploit that whenever creature we control exploits a non-token creature, we create a 2/2 black zombie creature token, so definitely good there. Also, Exploit works well with like Ghoulish Procession because we can sacrifice our creatures and get 2 zombie tokens essentially if we do exploit non-token creatures. Yeah, Falconeer Abomination, a 3 mana 2/2 that enters battlefield. We create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed, so yet again, a evasive creature that can fly over, as well as creating a token that can also be aggressive on the ground. Flip the Switch, 3 mana counter target spell unless controller pays 4. and then create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed. So a little bit of counter spell magic and a Dimir deck, which is definitely pretty decent. It is a little expensive at 3 mana, but you know, it's definitely a good early game if we want to keep up the tempo and the pressure on our opponents. They have Arch School of Throbbing, a 3 mana 3/2. Whenever it or another zombie control dies, we get to look at the top card of our library. If it's a zombie card, we can reveal it, put it into our hand. If we don't, we put that card into our hand, we can put it into our graveyard, so you can get rid of a land that you may not need or a spell that's not useful and mill it into the graveyard. So definitely a pretty cool option there. Got Fell Singer, a zombie scorpion, 3 mana 3/2 Death Toucher, which is good by itself. Also has the exploitability of that exploits a creature, target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life, so allows us to dig a little bit deeper into the deck, which is definitely pretty good. We got 2 copies of Hero's Downfall, a 3 mana destroy target creature or planeswalker. Yet again, a decent kind of spot removal spell for planeswalkers, so I do think it's a pretty decent choice there. In the 4 mana slot, we have Necroduality. I do think this is kind of like one of those cards that helps make zombies that much better. And the fact that whenever a non-token zombie enters the battlefield under our control, we create a token that's a copy of that creature, so it just creates more pressure with more zombies. So we get 2 copies of every zombie that we do play after playing this card. Then we got Organ Hoarder, 4 mana 3/2. Enters the battlefield. You get to look at the top 3 cards of our library. You get to put one of them into our hand and the rest into our graveyard. So just a little bit of digging a little bit deeper. So 4 mana, draw 1 and discard 2 into the graveyard. So definitely pretty decent there. And the mana base is, yet again, pretty straightforward. 24 lands, as we do kind of round out at 4 mana. So 9 islands, 11 swamps, and 4 of the Dismal Backwaters. You can also look at possibly doing the blue-black land from Streets of New Capenna if you want to look to possibly draw in additional cards, which is definitely a decent option. But life gain's always good as well, so you can always pick and choose it there depending on which ones you have. And then the sideboard, yet again, like the last deck, I got some options of cards that you may already have as well that you could always add to the deck to make it a little bit better. You got Graph Reaver, a 2 mana zombie that's a 3/3 with the exploitability that whenever it exploits a creature, we can destroy target planeswalker, so it's decent planeswalker removal. Though at the cost of, at the beginning of our upkeep, we actually get dealt 1 damage, so it's kind of like a plus and a minus built into a card. Jadar is also very good, as it itself will make zombie tokens at the end of our turn if we actually control no zombie tokens with Decayed, so definitely a good way to keep pressure up that way. Tainted Adversary is also another great 2 mana slot. Death Toucher, that's a 2/3 that has the ability of tapping 3 mana, and we can do that as many times as we can pay it. We put that many +1/+1 counters on it, and we create that twice that many 2/2 black zombie creature tokens with Decayed. So you get again a creature that one itself has Death Touch, which makes a great blocker, and 2, we get to put more pressure on the board by adding more zombie creature tokens. Got Geralf, Visionary Stitcher, a 3 mana 1/4. Gives all our zombies we control fly in, so definitely makes our zombies a little bit more evasive as they can fly over the top of the ground. Also for 1 mana, we can tap, sacrifice another non-token creature. We create an XX blue zombie creature token where X is the sacrifice creature's toughness. So if our opponent tries to play a removal spell on some other creature, we can sacrifice it in response and then create a zombie creature token that now has flying and can also fly over. So definitely good there. This is kind of one of those unique cards where you probably want to play a one-off, so it's definitely cool when you draw it, but it's not a card that you need to win. Got Headless Rider, another card that benefits us from whenever a non-token zombie creature we control dies. Create a 2/2 black zombie creature token, so it kind of, replaces that creature if that creature would die. Works very well with like a board wipe, so if our opponent has some sort of board wipe, all the creatures that would die from the board wipe, we get replaced by zombie creatures, so definitely good there. Got Overcharged Amalgam. I built a kind of like a counterspell zombie that has flash, so you can play it at any time. Has flying, and then has the exploitability that whenever it exploits a creature, you get to counter target spell, activate an ability, or trigger ability. So kind of depending on what the game situation, you can kind of stop a board removal. You can stop like a saga trigger from happening, or definitely, or an activate ability by having your opponent tap for something to activate some sort of ability. So definitely pretty good nonetheless. And then we got Shipwreck Marsh here. Yet again, this is kind of like the upgrade path for lands come rotation, as this is probably the best 2-color land that you can upgrade into. So adding 4 copies of this over the Dismal Backwater would definitely be a pretty good upgrade there. And then you have Otawara, Soren City, and Takanuma, Abandoned Mire. This one bounces return target artifact, creature, or enchantment, or planeswalker to its owner's hand. So a bounce effect for 4 mana. And it's also a blue mana source, but you probably only want like 1 copy. And then Takanuma, same thing, it's a black mana source, but for 4 mana we can discard it and mill 3 cards and return a creature or planeswalker card from the graveyard to our hand. So yet again, a way to get things back from the graveyard if they die in the early game. But overall, this is a pretty decent Dimir Zombie deck. I think zombies are definitely, yet again, another deck that has some decent cards to kind of make it pretty powerful, especially in the early standard, as we don't have too many sets to build on, and there's a lot of sets that kind of focus on zombies, just like vampires. Vampires. So overall, a pretty decent deck to kind of build around if you're looking for something interesting to play. Next deck up on the list is another deck that, this is another Dimir deck that I guess I've been focusing a lot on Dimir, but Dimir is also a pretty decent for some interesting creature tribal decks, and this one is Dimir Ninjas. It's a ninjutsu style deck that focuses on that ninjutsu ability that came with Kamigawa. It's kind of one of those deck types that I didn't get to play because I kind of took my little break from YouTube around Kamigawa released, so I didn't get to play a lot of it, but it does look pretty interesting on what it's trying to do. Essentially, ninjutsu's kind of that effect, if you don't really know what it does, is if we have a creature that doesn't get blocked whenever we attack in with it, we can pay a ninjutsu cost of one of our creatures in our hand and essentially replace the card that didn't get blocked with this ninjutsu creature, and then we get some sort of maybe trigger or activate ability whenever that creature deals damage to an opponent. So overall, ninjutsu is kind of a cool little tempo-y style ability. You can kind of play little mind games with ninjutsu, so you can attack in with a 1/1. Your opponent may think you're going to replace it with a creature, but you just let the 1/1 just attack in and deal damage that way. So definitely a cool little list nonetheless, and it's pretty budget friendly as there are a lot of cards just from Kamigawa for the most part that are part of this deck type. But in the 1-drop slot, we do have Thousand Face Shadow, a 1-mana 1/1, has an ninjutsu ability of 4, but the reason why it has an ninjutsu ability of 4 is because its ninjutsu effect is actually pretty decent. But when it enters the battlefield from our hand, if it's attacking, create a copy that's a copy of another target attacking creature. The token enters the battlefield also tapped and attacking, so it's like we can play it in the early game, we can ninjutsu it out for another creature, and then we can bring it back for the more expensive ninjutsu cost in the later game and actually get the secondary effect, and we get an additional tapped and attacking creature if that creature is still unblocked, which is definitely pretty good. It pushes that additional damage. Yeah, Fate and Hope, a couple copies just to kind of bounce something that could be in our way, allows us to get our ninjutsu off. Also, if that creature has mana value 3 or less, we get the scry one, so that's always beneficial. Got Network Disruptor, a 1-mana 1/1, enters the battlefield, tap target permanent. So if there's something in our way, or if we think our opponent may have something, we can always tap down on Mana Source or something like that, which definitely can help. Or just tap a creature that's in our way, which is definitely pretty beneficial. It also has flying, so we can kind of get over the ground game for the most part. We also have Spell Pierce because ninjutsu is kind of like a tempo style deck. In the early game, we can counter target non-creature spell unless it pays an additional 2, so definitely pretty good there. Got Moon Circuit Hacker, 2-mana 2/1 with ninjutsu 1. It's definitely pretty cheap ninjutsu with only being 1 mana. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card if you do discard a card unless it has entered the battlefield this turn. So the turn you ninjutsu it in is kind of like the turn that you don't have to discard, which makes it a pretty effective 1-mana spell to kind of cheat into the play. After that, we have Make It Disappear, 2-mana counter target spell unless the controller pays 2. And then for casualty of 1, we can sacrifice a creature and actually make it a copy of Make It Disappear and make our opponent have to pay 4 on that one particular spell. Or if they played multiple spells, we can counter both targets, which is definitely pretty good. Got Dukashi Silencer, 2-mana 2/1 with ninjutsu at 2, so either we pay for its full cost or we pay for its ninjutsu cost, but whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we may discard a creature card. When we do, we destroy target creature or we can destroy target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls or a player controls, so definitely pretty good there. Gets rid of something at the cost of discarding a creature card, so it's definitely a pretty decent removal spell nonetheless. Got Infernal Grasp as well in the deck, just always good to have just some spot removal spells. At 2 mana, destroy target creature at the cost of 2 life, not too bad. We got Silver for Master, 2 mana or ninjutsu 2 creature. It makes all our ninjutsu abilities cost 1 less to activate, and then gives all our other ninja and rogue creatures we control additional +1/+1. So if we kind of attack in, we don't have it out, we cheat this in. If something doesn't become blocked, then it pumps the team, which may catch our opponent off guard. And it's also not legendary, so we can have multiples of these out on the battlefield, which then effectively make our ninjutsu cost less. In the 3-drop slot, we have Prosperous Thief, a 3-mana 3/2 with a ninjutsu ability cost of 2. But whenever one or more ninja or rogue creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, we create a treasure token. Treasure mana is always very good, allows us to kind of maybe tap out, leave mana open, then with the treasure that we create, and then allows us to cast other spells, which is definitely pretty good, and in itself is a 3/2 that we can cheat on the battlefield only for 2 mana if we have a creature that becomes unblocked. We have Thirst for Discovery, a decent 3 mana, draw 3, discard 2, unless we discard a basic land card. This is a deck that curves out pretty low, so we actually don't need a ton of lands, so like 4 or 5 lands is probably more than enough for this deck. So we can definitely discard any extra lands we do draw, and 3 mana for draw 3, discard 1 is definitely good there. Just like the other decks that play black, I think Hero Downfall is in a decent spot to be a pretty decent destroy target creature or planeswalker spell for 3 mana instant speed, which is definitely very good. And then the mana base is pretty straightforward at being 11 islands, 9 swamps, and we got 2 waterfront districts. It's one of those things. You can also play the Dismal Backwaters if you have those. But the benefit of this one is that we can sacrifice it and draw a card in the later game if we're looking for an answer, or just trying to keep our hand full and kind of keep that tempo going. And then in the sideboard, we have some other options that you can also look to possibly add. You have Bite and Palm Ninja, 3 mana, 3/3 with Ninjutsu at 3. When it enters the battlefield with the menace counter on it, so it requires your opponent to have to block with 2 creatures. But whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we can remove the menace counter from it. And when we do, that player reveals their hand and chooses an online card from it, and we get to exile that card. So essentially, it's like a discard spell, but instead of discarding to the graveyard, discard to exile, which is definitely pretty good there. You got Nashi, Moonsage Scion, 3 mana, 3/2 with Ninjutsu of 4. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we exile top card of each player's library, and then until end of turn, we can play one of those cards. And if we cast a spell this way, we can pay life with its mana value rather than pay its mana cost. So if our opponent plays a color that we don't have the mana for, we can pay life to cast their spell. So definitely pretty good there. Kaito is definitely the Planeswalker for Ninjutsu. It's a 3 mana, 3 loyalty Planeswalker. At the end of our end step, if this is a turn that came into the battlefield, it phases out, so then it can't be targeted by spells or attacked. But it has a +1 ability of drawing a card and discarding a card unless we attack this turn. We get -2. We create a 1/1 blue ninja creature token with this creature can't be blocked, so it allows us to get that creature set up so we can maybe play some Ninjutsu cards along with that attack. And then -7, we get an emblem with whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a player, we have to search our library for a black-blue creature card and put it on the battlefield tapped, or onto the battlefield and then shuffle. So it allows us to kind of, get more creatures on the battlefield for essentially free. Then we have Satoru Urizawa, a 3 mana, 2/4 legendary human ninja. And then whenever we activate an Ninjutsu ability, we have to look at the top 3 cards of our library, put one of them into our hand, the rest in the bottom of our library, any random order. This ability triggers only once each turn, and each creature in our hand now has Ninjutsu of 4. So it just kind of gives everything Ninjutsu if it doesn't have it, but most of the cards in our deck have Ninjutsu, so just giving that additional way to trigger Ninjutsu if they don't have it, pretty good. Then we have March of the Wretched Sorrow, an interesting kind of instant spell that can be tapped for X. We can make it cost less by sacrifice or by discarding black cards from our hand. Make it cost 2 less, and we can deal X damage to target creature and Planeswalker, and we gain X life. So just another way to deal damage or remove something from the battlefield and gain life in the process. And then if you want to, you can add in Shipwreck Marshes to the deck, as these are lands that come in the battlefield untapped in the later game. And it's a better, I think, dual land than the tap dual lands that you have in the common and uncommon slots. But overall, pretty interesting deck. Definitely a pretty cool little tempo-y aggro deck. It's definitely something I'll probably check out as we get closer to that standard 2023 queue. Just as I don't know if it's in a good spot right now to play a more decked out version of the deck with the way the meta is. But definitely a cool deck to check out nonetheless. Now, the last deck up on the list is probably the strongest deck out of all of them, and I would say it's even possibly playable in the current standard, and that is Selesnya Enchantments. Enchantments is going to be going underneath one of those kind of like rebuilds when rotation happens, and this is definitely a deck that is probably in line to be still pretty strong, just because it doesn't really lose too much if it doesn't play, if like the typical Selesnya Enchantment decks don't really play runes. So this deck is definitely pretty strong in that regard, and a budget version of it is actually not too far off from the actual decked out version of it, so definitely pretty good in that regard. But we have, in the 1 mana slot, we have Commune with Spirits, allows us to look at top 4 cards of our library. We can reveal an enchantment or a land card among them and put into our hand, put the rest on the bottom of our library in a random order. So digging for a mana source or even digging for an enchantment, and we do play enchantment creatures, so we can also target those as well with this. So it allows us to dig a little bit deeper, find an enchantment or an enchantment creature, and add it to our hand, which makes it pretty good. We have Generous Visitor, a 1 mana 1/1 that whenever we cast an enchantment spell, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, whether itself or another creature we control. We got Circle and Confinement, a 2 mana enchantment, enters battlefield to exile target creature and opponent controls the mana value 3 or less. So just definitely a good way to get something out of the way in the early game. And then it also has the ability that whenever opponent casts a vampire spell with the same name as the card exile with Circle Confinement, we gain 2 life. The secondary ability probably won't have too much of effect, but it's definitely still there just in case vampires becomes popular and you see a lot of them. Got Hold for Ransom here, 2 mana enchantment aura that enchant target creature can't attack or block. And then tap 7, our opponent can tap 7, Hold for Ransom's controller sacrifices it and draws a card, activate only as a sorcery. So it's kind of one of those interesting ways to kind of get rid of things in the early game by making them not be able to be blocked. It's kind of more frustrating than anything. And we're going to try to finish off our opponent, but hopefully before they get to that 7 mana. We have Machako's Reign of Truth, a 2 mana enchantment that has chapters 1 and 2 of given target creature +1/+1 to end a turn for each artifact and or enchantment we control, which definitely buffs up any of our artifact or any of our enchantments that we have or any of our creatures we have on the battlefield. And then on chapter 3, we flip it over and we play the 0/0 version of it that gets +1/+1 for each other artifact are for each artifact or enchantment we control. So initially, if it's the only thing out, it'll be a 1/1, but we'll probably have multiple enchantments out, so it's at least will be a couple power and toughness, which is definitely pretty good there. You got Spirited Companion, a 2-mana 1/1 that when it enters the battlefield, we draw a card. So play for 2, get a card draw out of it, and a 1/1 enchantment creature, which is definitely pretty good. Got Kami of Transcience, one of the rares that we have in the deck, 2 copies of 2-mana 2/2 with trample. And then when we cast an enchantment spell, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Kami. And at the beginning of our each end step, if an enchantment was put into the graveyard from the battlefield this turn, we can return Kami from Transcience from the graveyard to our hand. So has a way to reoccur back. So even if they destroy one of our creatures, destroy an enchantment, we'll get Kami back if it's in the graveyard. So definitely a pretty strong card regardless. Got Jukai Naturalist, a 2-mana 2/2 with lifelink, and it makes our other enchantment spells, or other enchantments, I should say, cost 1 less to cast, so it gets rid of that colorless mana. There's a lot of enchantments that can go from 2 mana down to 1 mana, and then any of our 3 or higher drops go down an additional mana from there, so definitely makes our deck a little bit lower to the ground and regardless. And it also has lifelink and is a 2/2. In the 3-drop slot, we have Touch the Realm, Touch the Spirit Realm, a 3-mana enchantment that enters the battlefield with exile up to 1 target artifact and or creature into end of turn, or until it leaves the battlefield. Or we can channel it and discard it and exile target artifact or creature and return to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So definitely, depending on what the game state situation is, you can either flicker something out until end of turn, or you can completely remove it until it leaves the battlefield. So definitely good in that regard. Got Wedding Announcement at 3 mana, good enchantment that produces 1/1 vampire creature tokens. And then if we attack with 2 or more creatures, we get to draw a card, which is definitely pretty good. And on the 3rd time we do this, it flips over to the Wedding Festivity and gives all our creatures +1/+1, so buffing the team, which makes our whole squad bigger. And then in the I guess the top slot, even though it's technically a 7-drop, but technically, depending on where we play it and what we have on the board, it probably won't ever cost 7, but it's a 7-mana 4/4 that costs 1 less for each enchantment you control, and itself is also an enchantment creature. So if you have like a Jukai Naturalist out, we already are casting it for 2 less than its initial cost, and it's a 4/4 flyer that allows us to get a little bit of additional evasive damage in the air with it. And then this deck, yet again, is a little bit lower to the ground. This is an expensive spell, but we're probably not going to need 7 mana to cast it, so we can get away with playing 22 lands, so 10 plains, 8 forests, and then we have 4 of the Blossoming Sands. So yet again, a pretty decent deck. There is a version of it out there that I think currently in current standard that you can play, but this is definitely a list if you're looking for a budget way to play that and kind of work your way to a post-rotation version of it. And then the sideboard, we do have Kami of Transcience, just to add in some more additional copies of this. Is not also a legendary creature, so we have multiples of these out on the battlefield that will just gain benefit from us casting additional enchantments. You have Weaver of Harmony, yet again another great enchantment creature that's a 2/2 and gives all our other enchantment creatures we control additional +1/+1. And then for 1 mana, we can tap it, copy target, activate or trigger ability we control from enchantment source, and choose new targets for that copy. So for the most part, you can copy most of the abilities here. I think outside of Hold for Ransom, an additional time with this ability, which makes them that much better. So definitely pretty good there. Got Catilda, which is another great card for enchantments, as it is a creature that's a star, so it has power and toughness equal to the number of enchantments and or spirits we control, and then we can disturb it for 5, and we can give it an enchantment aura on target creature, giving it the same ability. It makes that creature gain lifelink, flying, and the protection from vampires, which is also pretty good. You got Wedding Announcement, which is another great card. Just to add in some more additional more copies of this to the deck will make it that much better. Hallowed Haunted is another great card for this deck, as it is one of those things that we can gain creatures every time we cast an enchantment spell. And then if we have 7 or more enchantment spells, creatures we control have flying and vigilance. And then add in some additional copies of Overgrown Farmland instead of the other tap land is definitely pretty good, as this land in the later game will come in the battlefield untapped. But overall, Selesnya Enchantments is in a good position to be, yet again, another great deck. Another enchantment deck that I think people are going to get sick of pretty quickly when rotation does happen. But with that being said, guys, let me know in the comments below, if there's any of these lists that catch your eye. Is there something else that you were thinking about possibly playing come rotation? Let me know in the comments below. If you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. And until next time, I'll see you in the next video. Just want to give a special shout out to the channel members here on my YouTube channel. You can also become a channel member yourself down below the video, hitting that join button. It definitely helps out a lot, and I just appreciate you guys for your support.